You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 24.
"You're kidding, right?" Burnmaster asked after nobody uttered a sound. "Not at all," Nikki replied. "I didn't write that letter. I'm sure I would remember writing something like that. It's not even in my handwriting." Burnmaster swallowed the hard lump in his throat. "Maybe you're still feeling the effects of the dehydration," he suggested. "Like Pemba said, that sort of thing can make a person's mind play all sorts of tricks." Nikki shook her head. "I don't think so," she replied. Further discussion on the matter resolved nothing. Nikki was quite coherent, and after a while Burnmaster conceded that her mind and memory did not seem affected by her recent near-death experience. Nor was she lying, so that left only one possibility: somebody else had sent him the letter. The problem with that conclusion was that it was a dead end. He had no idea who would do such a thing or why. Whoever was responsible had gone to a lot of trouble, creating a fake yeti tooth and getting a news article published about it. Not only that, they had used information about his personal life to make him believe the letter was genuine. It just didn't make sense that somebody would go to such lengths to trick him. He didn't have any enemies and could think of nobody who would want to harm his professional reputation. It was starting to look like a bizarre practical joke. He liked jokes, but if that was what the letter was, it was ridiculous. Coming to Nepal on such short notice had been a major decision for him. He was unprepared for an expedition, but in reliance on the letter he decided to take the risk. That's what bothered him the most. He had placed his life and the teenagers' lives in danger. The Himalayas was no place for half-trained or half-hearted adventurers. He had never felt comfortable about bringing them here, but he had gotten caught up in the excitement of finding a real yeti. Now that the tooth and the news story had been revealed as fakes, he was decidedly uncomfortable about the whole thing. The last thing he needed was for Prince Laheeti, sole heir to the Vavu throne, to be hurt on this wild goose chase. They had already had enough close shaves with death. The sooner the teenagers' feet were safely back on Vavu soil, the better. He instructed everybody to pack up their gear and get ready to go. Isabelle and Laheeti went to work on their tent in silence. They both felt empty inside. For them, the significance of the fake letter was that their adventure in Nepal was over. It was difficult to believe that their search for the yeti had come to such an abrupt and unsatisfactory end. Flat Top was also struggling to come to terms with the situation. He angrily stuffed his tent into its protective cover. "She's lying, she has to be," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Why would she lie?" asked Maine. "Because she wants to keep the tooth for herself," Flat Top growled. "She looked like she was telling the truth to me," said Mohawk. Flat Top scoffed and replied, "All the best liars do." Maine watched his brother. "I know where you're going with this," he said. "You want to get rid of the others and find out what Nikki knows about the tooth." Flat Top's eyes blazed. "The 2 days are up and now is the perfect time to do it," he grunted. "How about we wait until we get to the bottom of the mountain?" Maine suggested. Flat Top shook his head. "Too risky," he stated. "She might die on the way down." "Okay," Maine replied. "How about halfway down?" Flat Top stopped packing and glanced at Maine. "What's the point of that?" he retorted. "So we can get rid of all the bodies in a crevasse," Maine replied coolly, but his stomach turned at the thought. "We're going to kill them all, right?" Flat Top grinned. "I like the way you think," he said. "I knew your training hadn't worn off. All right, halfway down, I'm looking forward to the climb already." He resumed packing with new vigor. Mohawk and Maine glanced at each other uneasily. No words were said, but each knew what the other was thinking. They had run out of excuses to keep Flat Top at bay. The time had come to choose between his life and the lives of Burnmaster and his team. Deep down, both of them knew that this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Flat Top's mind was infected by evil, but he was their beloved brother. The trio had grown up together, and the bonds between them were strong. Cutting his safety rope and pushing him off the mountain would be the ultimate betrayal, one that would stay with Mohawk and Maine for the rest of their lives. But there was no other way. They continued packing in silence, their genetically engineered hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they had to do. Burnmaster spent the morning pondering how to safely get Nikki down the mountain. He didn't talk to her about it, but he figured she was thinking the same thing. The options were few. Even though she was able to move around, she was in no state to climb. That meant somebody had to carry her down every step of the way. On a stretch of flat terrain, an adult male could carry another for many kilometers in survival situations. But climbing down a vertical mountain was another matter entirely. Most experienced climbers were honest enough to admit that a challenge like that was beyond them, and Burnmaster was no exception. He was considering how to raise this thorny problem with Nicky when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around and looked up at the strangely simian features of Flat Top. It was unusual for the giant Korean to start a conversation. "What's wrong?" Burnmaster asked. "Nothing," Flat Top grunted. "I just thought I'd come and ask if you need any help." Burnmaster was about to say no but checked his reply. He looked the big man up and down. "How much do you weigh?" he inquired. Flat Top frowned at the unexpected question and replied, "About 150 kilograms. Why?" "About 3 times Nicky's body weight," Burnmaster thought. He did the maths in his head and decided Flat Top would probably be strong enough to carry her down the mountain. Burnmaster didn't like placing her life in the hands of a stranger with untested climbing skills, but the options were limited. Ultimately, it was her call, not his, but if she didn't want to go for it, she would have to come up with another suggestion. Burnmaster sized up the giant. "I need you to carry Nicky down the mountain," he explained. "You're the only one who's strong enough." "What about Gulbenkian?" Flat Top snorted. "He's responsible for Laheeti," Burnmaster said. "And Mohawk and Maine?" asked Flat Top. "I watched you coming up the mountain," Burnmaster replied. "You're a better climber than they are." Flat Top privately agreed that that was true. Nicky stopped packing and looked up at the giant Korean, waiting for his answer. Flat Top grinned at her. "In that case, it would be my pleasure," he said, and he meant it. Mohawk and Maine learned about Burnmaster's plan a short time later and immediately realized that it put a gorilla-sized hole in their own plan to do away with their beloved but deeply evil brother. It would be nigh impossible to push Flat Top off the mountainside and save Nicky when she was strapped to his back. They looked at each other hopelessly. They had less than one day to work out what to do, and the clock was ticking. In the days since they arrived at the glacier, a small avalanche had obscured the climbing route they used to ascend the mountain. Burnmaster considered the alternatives and eventually settled on a new route which was, ironically, the same path Nicky had used with catastrophic results a few weeks earlier. She pointed that out to Burnmaster, but he just shrugged. "I would have preferred the other route, but that's not an option anymore," he said. "Now this one's the easiest way down." The others accepted Burnmaster's judgment without comment. They went over the edge one at a time, roped together in pairs with Burnmaster and Pemba leading the way. The GXs went last, roped together as a trio, and Nicky strapped to Flat Top's enormous back. He moved with a natural, almost monkey-like rhythm, but each movement was a jolting experience on her broken body. It was painful, and the packet of painkillers in Burnmaster's medical kit was almost empty. She was grateful for the rescue, but hoped the climb down would be over quickly. The group stopped regularly to rest. Burnmaster prayed for continued good weather, and his prayers were answered. The afternoon sky was crystal clear and visibility was perfect. They could see for miles in all directions. At one of the rest stops, Nicky pointed out the crevasse she had fallen into, about 50 meters below. Burnmaster heard the fearful tremor in her voice and glanced down at the crevasse's gaping dark mouth. He decided not to remind her that Pemba had, in fact, found her lying in the snow on the glacier. There would be time enough later for establishing what really happened. He merely nodded and said, "We'll be past it soon, and then you won't have to worry about it anymore." Flat Top eyed the crevasse with the others. It would be a perfect place to dispose of their bodies. As he looked down at the black hole in the mountainside, he felt a strong sense of his own power. There would be no more delays. It was time for some real soldiering. He permitted himself a small smile and flexed his huge fingers. Cool, relaxed, dangerous. At the next rest stop, he would wait for everybody to gather close and then in a blur of motion dispatch them into the crevasse. Gulbenkian would be first to neutralize any threat the big islander posed. Then it would be Burnmaster's turn, followed by Pemba, and finally the teenagers. Flat Top visualized the shocked looks on their pathetic faces as they sailed through the air to their doom. Mohawk and Maine could stand back and watch or help him. It wouldn't make any difference. Then Nicky would be alone. She would tell him where the real Yeti tooth was, or she would die. Burnmaster gave the signal and the climb continued. Flat Top put on his best poker face. His brothers, who knew him well, exchanged worried glances. They climbed in silence for the next 50 meters, feeling their opportunities to do away with their brother quickly disappearing. The next rest stop was beside the crevasse. Mohawk and Maine were still trying to work out how to separate Nicky from their brother when she suddenly said, "Can you let me down for a few minutes, Flat Top? I really need to stretch my legs." The giant GX grunted and untied the ropes that strapped her to him. When her boots were on the snow, she stood up stiffly and stretched her back. She gingerly moved around the small area they had stopped in but stayed away from the mouth of the crevasse. Mohawk and Maine became very still. With horrible reluctance, they knew what they had to do. There would be no more opportunities. It was their brother's life or the lives of everybody else. He was more than just their brother, he was their twin. Killing him would be like killing themselves. They both took deep breaths at the same time and stood up. Flat Top was facing the other direction. They positioned themselves on either side of him, their huge arms hanging loose and ready to strike. Flat Top didn't notice. Mohawk flicked his eyes over to Mane and nodded, indicating that he was ready. Mane balled one huge hand into a fist and began to raise it. Suddenly, Flat Top spun around and looked from one brother to the other. He inclined his head, listening to something far away. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Mohawk and Mane froze, with guilty looks on their half-human faces. It took them a moment to realize that their brother didn't suspect anything. "Hear what?" asked Mane. Flat Top raised his head slowly and looked up the mountain. "That rumbling sound," he replied quietly, "like the sound of a waterfall coming from above." Burnmaster shuffled past Pemba and came over. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "What rumbling sound?" For a second Mane thought his brother was trying to divert their attention and thwart their attack. But then he heard it too, a faint rumble of sound from the top of the mountain, like a peal of thunder. He stared up, his eyes searching for the sudden storm, but saw only blue sky. In the moments that followed, the rumble multiplied in volume until it sounded like 1,000 horses galloping down the mountain. Now the oncoming roar was audible to everybody. The teenagers looked up in alarm and stepped back uncertainly. The memory of the landslide that buried their bus on the way to Shabrubesi had been burned into their minds forever. The roar of 1,000 tons of earth and snow plummeting towards them they would always associate with certain doom. Twig placed his hand on a rock and could feel the mountain itself vibrating. He shook his head in disbelief. "This can't be happening," he muttered. An expanding white fog filled the air as the tidal wave of snow accelerated down the mountainside. "Is that what I think it is?" asked Isabelle. "It can't be," exclaimed Laheeti, "because avalanches never strike twice." "Lightning never strikes twice," howled Pemba. "Avalanches can strike as many times as they want. Do you think maybe you could have told me that before we climbed this mountain?" Isabelle screamed. The imminent danger meant there was no hint of a stutter in Gulbenkian's voice. "We'd better do something right now, or we're all going to be blasted straight to the bottom of Langtang," he bellowed. Burnmaster was already reaching into his rucksack. "Quickly, everybody put an ice screw in and latch on," he ordered. "There's no time," cried Nikki, "and even if there were, the avalanche will crush us. The only way to survive is to find cover." "What cover?" replied Burnmaster as he drove one ice screw in. "In case you've forgotten, this is the side of a mountain." Nikki looked at the dark crevasse and repressed a shudder. "The crevasse," she yelled. "It's our only chance." "What?" cried Burnmaster. "The crevasse can protect us," Nikki pressed. "The avalanche will pass right over our heads." "Are you crazy?" howled Burnmaster. "The fall will kill us just as surely as the avalanche will." "No, it won't," Nikki replied. "There's a ledge 15 meters down." "I know because I landed on it when I fell into that crevasse." Burnmaster shook his head stubbornly. "You weren't in the crevasse, you were on the glacier," he said forcefully. "So the reality is you don't know what's down there. The reality is that we're about to get swept off the mountain by an avalanche, and that crevasse is our only chance to survive," Nikki retorted. Burnmaster was torn between making the smart decision and trusting Nikki. He pointed an accusing finger at her. "If you're wrong, we're all dead," he snapped. "If we stay here, we're all dead anyway," she replied. The Battle of Wills lasted for only a second, then he threw a bundle of yellow rope into the crevasse. It sailed into the darkness, and the end attached to the ice screw grew taut. Then he wrapped his arms around Isabelle and lifted her off the ground. "Protect the teenagers," he said. Gulbenkian seized Laheeti and Pemba seized Twigger. "Hey, what are you doing?" exclaimed Isabelle. Nikki hobbled over to the dark mouth of the crevasse. She looked back at Burnmaster, then stepped over the edge and disappeared. Burnmaster yelled after her, but the roar of the avalanche drowned out his voice. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he gripped Isabelle tightly and stared into the blackness. It was like jumping into an elevator shaft and hoping the top of the lift was not too far below. Isabelle wrapped her arms and legs around him and held on tight. Then he stepped off the edge and disappeared into the crevasse. Gull and Laheeti were quick to follow. Just before Pemba was about to jump, he turned to the Koreans and yelled, "I wouldn't wait any longer if I were you." Then he disappeared into the darkness with Twig. Flat Top watched him go and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he could not do the same thing. "There's no way I'm jumping into that hole," he growled. "Who knows how small that crevasse is down the bottom? I'd rather take on this avalanche than get stuck down there." He faced his brothers. "You two go without me," he said. "Finish the mission. Tell the Grand Marshal I fought bravely. Tell him yourself, yelled Mohawk. His hair was flattened by the gale force wind. I'm not jumping down there either. Climbing this mountain is where I draw the line. Jumping down a huge hole is out of the question. Same here, howled Maine. I bet it's blacker than midnight down there, so I say we make a stand here together, and die here together if that's the fate that awaits us, bellowed Flat Top. The three super soldiers smiled grimly at each other and linked arms, monkey grip style. Only a minute ago, Mohawk and Maine were preparing to kill their beloved brother. Now the trio stood together as a family against the might of the oncoming avalanche. The ground beneath their boots began to shake. Then the wall of snow and ice swept over them with the force of a volcanic eruption and blasted them off the mountain.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.